You know, I think it's pretty interesting how much the age at which you discovered Harry Potter affects whether you like it or not. I know you're probably thinking something like, dude, duh, adults don't like a kid's thing, you're a genius. But what I mean is that this seems to happen more with Harry Potter than pretty much any other franchise as far as I can tell. And I mean, obviously Harry Potter is huge, so finding someone that actually hasn't seen it or even read the books yet, let alone someone that openly admits to not liking it, is pretty rare. But whenever that does happen and someone asks for a recommendation from my childhood, I find that I'm much more likely to recommend something like The Last Airbender, or even, I mean, the Bartimaeus trilogy is a banger deep cut for anyone looking for a fun YA book. So the question is, why? Why are the Potter books and movies so much more susceptible to not being enjoyed by adults than usual? I want to address the whole "they're kids' books" thing first, because while I do think that kids' books have a tendency to be a lot more simplistic, I don't really think that absolves them of a need for internal consistency. Like, there's really no reason to have a hard magic system a la Mistborn in a kid's book, where every little detail about how the magic works is explained. To give another example, there's a very clear and huge difference between the level of detail in The Hobbit, which is primarily aimed at kids, and Lord of the Rings. And while The Hobbit is definitely far more simple and lighthearted in tone, there isn't really anything in it that could be labeled as a self-contradiction. Again, just because something is a kid's book doesn't always mean that it is inherently simplistic and completely vapid of meaning. The Chronicles of Narnia, for example, are all just a big allegory for Christianity. Going outside of literature, I mean, just look at The Last Airbender and explorations of genocide. There's a whole lot of complexity in that one, what with the Fire Nation being the superficially villainized entity at the beginning, but then having the curtain slowly pulled back as we learn more about it. I mean, I could point to Uncle Iroh and how he's actually a genuinely good person who actively helps Team Avatar, even though he's Fire Nation. Or even in the third book, when our protagonists hide out in the Fire Nation and we learn that the people there are just normal kids being taught your typical fascist bullshit propaganda. All that to say that, yeah, the whole "you're reading too much into it, these are for kids" argument is completely invalid. In fact, the more complex themes that are alluded to in children's media, the more likely it is to probably appeal to adults. I mean, just look at like all of Pixar's filmography, for fuck's sake, and how many people love those movies regardless of their age. Now, Harry Potter does absolutely have complex themes in it. I mean, no one is going to say that Wizard Hitler is a simple thing to take on, even though saying it like that, I mean, it sounds silly. But you know, they do exist. I mean, the whole blood purity thing is a relatively complex idea. The problem is the way it's handled is not really nuanced in any way at all. Which is kind of funny, because that means that the people who say that everyone is reading too much into these books they're kind of right, just not for the reasons you or they would think they are. I think at this point, most people are pretty familiar with all of the criticism that Harry Potter's faced in recent years. I think a lot of the criticism is extremely valid, but at the same time, I'm also seeing all these video essays and articles that give J.K. Rowling, like, entirely too much fucking credit. What I mean is, she's Miles Braun from that Knives Out sequel. Okay, so Glass Onion wasn't the greatest movie ever. It was fine, honestly. Like, it was just a fun movie. The first one with Ana de Armas was miles, pun intended, better. What Glass Onion does really well, though, and which is something that I thought was pretty interesting, was that it completely flipped the assumption that both the characters and the audience had, that the billionaire Miles Braun was a genius. The beginning of the movie frames him that way, and as the mystery is slowly unraveled, we learn from Benoit Blanc the truth, that the guy's an idiot. Now, obviously, this is meant to parody your everyday tech billionaire and how the public has a tendency to just assume that they are geniuses. Elon Musk being the primary sorta, you know, wink wink, Miles was him, even though Ryan Johnson has repeatedly said it's not. Like, come on, we know. But I really do think this applies to J.K. Rowling, especially because of how just insanely famous she is and how many books she's sold. I mean, you know, how just ridiculously deeply her world has burrowed into pop culture. There's a tendency out in the world to think of writers as geniuses, just like with tech CEOs. And while I think a few writers could probably be labeled as such, you know, like, it doesn't really take one to know one when it comes to writers like James fucking Joyce. J.K. Rowling, yeah, she might have sold a bunch of stuff, but
no! It's just dumb!
I think she's just an idiot. Like, honestly, she never had any control of her world, like, at all. But also even more hilarious, okay, so the Time Turners are the go-to that everyone uses as their "the fuck were you thinking" element. It's hilarious that they were originally used as this fun little twist to what would have been a pretty sad ending to Prisoner of Azkaban, but there was zero consideration for the consequences of their use to the overall world. And when this was brought up much later, once Cedric was killed in the 4th book, her reaction was to have Neville just accidentally bump into them in Order of the Phoenix while they're in the Ministry of Magic, and one of them falls weirdly, and so they all get stuck in this loop where they're no longer usable, like, ever? Sorry guys, Neville broke time travel. I mean, apparently every single one ever made was in that box, and they can never make one ever again for some reason, so, you know, it's such a stupid and shitty solution to a problem that she caused for herself, especially when you consider the fact that the plot of Prisoner of Azkaban is a perfectly closed loop. Like, she could have just said time turners can't actually alter events at all, which, I mean, it's actually in the book. Like, it's even in the movie too. Look at this moment.
You were right, Hermione. It wasn't my dad I saw earlier. It was me. I saw myself conjuring the Patronus before. I knew I could do it this time because, well, I'd already done it. Does that make sense? No!
That's exactly what it is. Sorry, you can't actually change stuff in the past because it's already happened. You're just following the same timeline, so no matter how many times you go back in time to stop Voldemort from killing Harry's parents, you'll fail because that's not what happened. But freaking Bozo over here just, I mean, I don't know, did she forget what she wrote? Did she got so hung up on people's criticism that she put herself in a stupid loop and decided to do the same to the time turners? I don't know. It's just hilarious to me that she then went and wrote Cursed Child. Like, that play, it's not just one of the dumbest things ever, but like, it's such an exercise in egregious pettiness. Everyone criticized that they never went back to save Cedric. So she has Harry's kid do exactly that, and then apparently that causes Cedric Diggory, Hogwarts golden boy, and a guy who was beloved by everyone and praised for his niceness, turn evil because of it. She took the biggest thing people used to criticize her story and doubled down, completely misreading what she'd already written and misunderstanding the version of time travel she'd put in her book in the first place, completely ignoring how it all contradicts the character she'd written, all to make some elaborate, revenge-based I told you so leveled at her critics. This is not a genius writer. This is the kind of pettiness you'd expect from a narcissistic grade A moron.
It's just dumb.
And this is why I think people give her entirely too much credit. I'll give you another example. So Numbnuts over here goes out and says that Remus Lupin, a guy whose name basically translates to Wolfie McWolfface, is a metaphor for HIV/AIDS. So, well, let's unpack that for a second. Because, I mean, okay, the whole AIDS epidemic back in the 80s was a really, really big deal. You might not be old enough to remember. Hell, I'm not old enough to remember. I wasn't even born. But there was a lot of extremely irrational fear in the general population when it came to the disease. Because there was basically no cure at the time, AIDS was essentially a death sentence. And even worse, since an understanding of how it was contracted wasn't well understood in general, people basically thought that if you were to, like, just touch someone with it, you'd get it too. It's very much this moment from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
We're in Uganda doing a lot of work with the AIDS crisis there. And
AIDS? You touch anybody?
well, sure.
Hey, man! What kind of shit is that? You just hugged me! Why would you do that?
Seamus is joking. He's got a very dry sense of humor.
I'm not joking. That shit is serious. I gotta take a shower now.
And yeah, that's played for laughs and everything, but this whole thing was a huge issue. People stopped going to the dentist, stopped going to public pools, ostracized family members. You know, it also just added an insane amount of fuel to an already rampant homophobia, so there's that. Anyways, back to Harry Potter. So Lupin's a werewolf, and everyone is terrified of werewolves in the Potterverse. He gets fired immediately once people find out what he is. Parents don't want him around their children because they're scared he will bite them. It's a whole thing. The Wolfsbane potion exists, but the fact that it stops people from going full irrational monster is largely ignored by the wizarding world. Lupin is terrified that if he has a son, he will pass his disease onto him. Like, you're seeing the parallels, right? We see how all this affects Lupin negatively, and we feel for this poor man who's actually a good and compassionate person, and who is shunned by most for something that's not only not in his control, but also just not his fault. Honestly, credit where credit is due, it kind of works as a metaphor. However, this is not Angels in America. This isn't Tony Kushner. This is Joanne Kathleen Rowling. The thing is, while Lupin is portrayed as a good guy who does not want to hurt anyone, the fact is werewolves in the Potterverse are monstrous beings with no ability to think about anything except violence, kill, eat, bite. The metaphor basically just falls apart, like very quickly under any sort of microscope. People in the 80s were rationally terrified that they'd be infected with AIDS, but the fear was irrational because, well, stand in a room with a gay man and you're probably going to be fine. But a werewolf? You know, I don't think even the most irrationally compassionate person would want to be in a room with one who'd gone fully feral. I mean, Lupin nearly kills everyone when he becomes one in Prisoner of Azkaban, right? Suddenly the metaphor transforms, much like Lupin, from this loving thing bred out of compassion into a questionably violent monster. You start to wonder what exactly it is that Joanne is trying to say about people infected with HIV. Are we supposed to see them as these poor souls afflicted with something out of their control, who are unfairly ostracized because of irrational fear? Or are they Fenrir Greyback, who's out there purposely infecting fucking children? And I genuinely don't think she wrote this as some sort of ultra homophobic thing. I think she actually was actively trying to explore how difficult it was for people with HIV to even get a job back then. But the problem is, she's Miles Braun. So of course she remembers she's got werewolves in her story, realizes she needs to do something with them, knows they're inherently violent creatures, makes up a truly terrifying being, Fenrir Greyback, has them all join Wizard Hitler, and completely forgets to consider what these decisions do for the metaphor she built before. And then, well, you know, surprise Pikachu face when people question if she's homophobic. I mean, the same thing happened with the house elves. People criticize them because they introduced a little concept to the wizarding world. You might have heard of it. Slavery! So yeah, house elves are based on these little creatures from Scottish lore called brownies, which basically love cleaning and they'll do their thing while you're sleeping at night. Brownies can also be mischievous and they'll make your life a living hell if you mistreat them and can leave whenever they want. Now JoJo decided to explore what would happen if one of these creatures didn't like cleaning, and then created Dobby as a result. Now in order for Dobby to know that there was a plot against Harry in the second book, she needed a reason for him to be around bad people. But obviously, well, why would any ultra-powerful creature who's genuinely good be around bad people? Well, not because they're a spy for Dumbledore, not because they've realized the error of their ways, but far more simply, because they have no choice. So she decides to go with the easiest reason for why Dobby would be constantly hanging around the Malfoys, aka he's their slave. So now to keep things simple, again, she makes this the case for all house elves. Like, yeah, why the hell not, right? Like, it increases the conflict around Harry and our protagonist and makes the Malfoys look even worse because they're treating Dobby like shit. The problem is she, again, didn't think of the consequences of what she was doing. And, again, in the most J.K. Rowling way possible, chooses the most inelegant and dumb solution to the problem she creates for herself. Rather than saying, yeah, I was wrong, maybe the wizards are wrong, let's have them work for change, she doubles down. She has Hermione start spew, but then has Ron tell her that the house elves like being enslaved, and triples down with Winky, the house elf who is freed and who becomes an alcoholic because her freedom leaves her without a purpose. So look, the tendency with all this is to go full political and talk about JK's ideals and how the status quo in Harry Potter doesn't change. For example, Voldemort comes in and just starts wrecking the Ministry's shit. But after he's been defeated, nothing changes. Wizards are still on top, the racism towards goblins and centaurs and giants is still very much active. Like, 0 lessons have been learned. We just got rid of the bad wizard and that was what was wrong, not, you know, the violence inherent in the system. And again, I just feel like this is giving Rowling too much credit. Now don't get me wrong, a socio-political reading of Harry Potter is very much deserved, but whenever I see this stuff, things like Hermione not actually getting anywhere with spew or the whole Lupin thing, I don't see someone cleverly pushing their politics. I see a person who refuses to admit she was wrong about a certain decision she made, a person who thinks so highly of themselves that they just double, triple, even quadruple down on their shit. The thing with the cursed child, where she basically says, fuck the critics, I'll show them they're wrong, is very much a pattern of behavior you see for pretty much every single bit of criticism her books receive. Which brings me to how static everything is in this world. Now I mentioned earlier that by the end of these books, nothing has changed in the wizarding world. The system is exactly the same as it was before, and the Ministry functions in the exact same way as it always has. Most of the analysis that I see for this particular issue within the books tends to focus on Rowling's politics, talking about how this is all a symptom of her political ideals. But again, while I think that's true, I don't think it was purposeful, because, well, let's look at what Joanne actually did. In very simple terms, Rowling believes in the system that already exists in the real world, and she built her world around said system, then proceeded to create an evil wizard that went and took advantage of said system in every way imaginable and with incredible ease, proving that the system doesn't work. And then she finished her book by re-implementing the system she had proven to herself was wrong. Does that sound like someone who thought this through?
No! It's just dumb.
Look, politics, idiocy, all of that aside, the biggest and most important element for pretty much any story ever is change. Now, change can happen in any way imaginable, be it characters, world building, whatever. I started this essay talking about why I think these books appeal to adults as much as other children's media. And while I think my tangent about her being a dum-dum applies because adults usually have a better critical eye than children, and a lot of her stuff just totally falls apart when you look at it critically for a second, I think the biggest culprit for this issue is how static everything is. Again, I don't think the status quo not changing at the end of the books is an example of her letting her political ideology seep into her writing, because they're not the only thing that stays exactly the same. And so my reading of it is more like, she's not very good at this whole writing business. Because let's look at our protagonists, the Golden Trio. At the beginning of the series, Harry is brave, loyal, he's got a strong sense of justice, and is willing to put himself in danger for his friends. He's impulsive and stubborn, and also has a bit of a temper. At the end of the series, Harry is brave, loyal, he's got a strong sense of justice, and is willing to put himself in danger for his friends. He's impulsive and stubborn, and also has a bit of a temper. Hermione at the beginning of the series is intelligent, a bit of a know-it-all, can be bossy, and is often not the best when put in real-world situations of danger. By the end of the series, she's intelligent, a bit of a know-it-all, can be bossy, and is often not the best when put in real-world situations of danger. Should I even do Ron? I'm gonna do him dirty here, just like the movies did him dirty too, but the point still stands. There is no change at all. The last sentence of the book is, all was good. But all should not be good. These children, mind you, should be traumatized by the shit they've seen. How are they not in a freaking psych ward for real? Their friends died, their government was shown to be incredibly easy to exploit. Harry was used as like a pig for slaughter. Their entire world was torn apart by a guy that wanted to commit genocide. But nah, man, Harry's kid is scary, he's gonna be in Slytherin, you know? It's ridiculous. Look, static characters are not interesting, and I'm going to absolutely get into why these books were so appealing to kids in a little bit, but this just isn't good writing. Who changes in these books? Fred loses his twin brother but is ultimately fine, Hagrid's the same, Ginny's the same, McGonagall, Neville, the Dursleys, fucking Snape? Yeah, our perception of Snape kinda sorta changes a little bit because of the whole, he loves Lily thing or whatever. Like a gross obsession, but who cares? But, did he change? No, he was a bully in the beginning, middle, and end, and was only ever a self-serving, self-victimizing incel. I'll give you Draco Malfoy kind of going through a little sum-sum, but that only ever happens in the final book, just like Snape. They're completely static and unchanged until the very, very, very end. Look at The Last Airbender's handling of characterization instead. Sokka's a raging sexist who realizes he was wrong and slowly matures over the course of 3 seasons into a fierce leader who literally commands adults in a fight against tyranny. Aang goes from a scared little kid who doesn't want to face his responsibilities into a fully fledged avatar who fights for what he believes is right. Zuko goes from a mistreated and lost child who lashes out in anger from pain and trauma into a humble man who realizes the error of his family's ways and works to be a good person. These characters are interesting because of the fact that they change throughout the story. This is what good writing actually looks like. In Harry Potter, okay, so Ron spends a little bit of time feeling super jealous of Harry in the 4th book because Harry is in the Triwizard Tournament. Does that ultimately go anywhere? No. Aside from a little bit of drama where they're annoyed at each other and which fuels Harry's angst, there are 0 consequences. Harry's view of Ron doesn't change, Ron's view of Harry doesn't change, their friendship stays exactly the same, and neither of them learn absolutely anything because the whole shebang is basically repeated again in Deathly Hallows. This time for other reasons, Horcrux, but still, you can have the most interesting world ever, but if you fill it with superficial shit, people very quickly lose interest. Just look at Avatar.
Water.
Not that Avatar, the blue people. Pandora is beautiful to look at. The people who like the movies love them because they like this planet with all its shiny plants and how ridiculously good everything looks, but most people don't talk about Avatar all that much or don't really rewatch the movies either because, well, everything is so surface level that there's very little reason to return to Pandora at all. This is basically the case with Harry Potter. The world building is superficial, the characters are superficial, the plot is superficial. The problem becomes that if you discover these books past a certain age, well, there's really nothing for you here. Like, I grew up with these books and these movies. I read them all in a single sitting the second they came out. I went to midnight releases, but I find myself returning to this world less and less, to the point that I mean, basically the only Potter movie I still watch with a little bit of frequency is Prisoner of Azkaban, and most of that doesn't have anything to do with the story itself or the characters or the magic. It's mostly because of Alfonso Cuarón and the way he directed the thing. But okay, so if these books and this franchise actually kind of sucks, why is it so popular? Well, first of all, the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone or Sorcerer's Stone, wherever, depending on where you're from, had a massive marketing campaign. If this is a surprise to you, I mean, maybe come out from under that rock you've been living under, dude. What are you doing? We live in a capitalist society. You think things just blow up organically? Come on. Big guys gotta make their cash. So obviously, well, it's not surprising the series was gonna, at the very least, gain some public attention. I'm not gonna talk about the marketing because, well, I totally believe that marketing is generally necessary for something to become as gigantic as this franchise. It's true that if it hadn't at least done something right, like, yeah, it wouldn't be around still. So it's that something that I find most interesting, so here we go. Now, for all the shit I've given J.K. Rowling in this video, Hogwarts, look at me, Hogwarts was fucking genius. I'm not talking about the castle itself, although it's pretty cool. What I'm talking about is this. Middle-earth is awesome. It's the coolest, most incredible world ever made, period. The Star Wars universe is sick. Jedis are dope and they do dope shit. Now, am I ever going to be able to walk the fields of Pelennor? Am I ever going to be able to use the Force to grab the TV remote when I left it too far away and I'm feeling lazy and depressed? Fuck no. But the Wizarding World? Hell yeah! At least that's what little 8-year-old me thought when I read Harry Potter. Because that's the thing. The genius of it is that it left a small possibility of it being a real thing. Kids were reading these books around the time when they were figuring out Santa Claus wasn't real. Obviously, a small part of you was thinking, there's no chance a dude's riding a sled across the world giving everyone presents, but you still believed that he was out there. At the same time, you might not have ever heard of anyone that was older than you suddenly disappearing and going to Hogwarts, but, you know, what if? You know, what if little Timmy, who fucked off to Florida to be with his grandparents 2 years ago, didn't actually go to Florida and is actually just knee-deep in Defense Against the Dark Arts? It's the 90s, there's no FaceTime, you're never gonna talk to Timmy again, you don't know what he's up to. Every single kid who was a Potterhead before the age of 11 was dying to get a Hogwarts letter in the mail. And that is what introduced us to the Wizarding World and made us fall in love with it.
Not me, not Hermione, you.
Look, so all of Harry Potter is set up to give Harry as much importance as possible and to basically flip his shitty cupboard life completely. He goes from being hated and poor to rich and famous, goes from having no one, no friends, nothing, to tons of friends and tons of people who care about him. Rowling sacrificed a shit ton of stuff in order to make this true. Harry, a kid who was basically abused and tortured his entire life, should be hugely traumatized and antisocial. In the books, he's fine. He's kind of miserable at the Dursleys, but otherwise he's fine. Quidditch, another example, was a terrible sport. It makes zero sense for the Seeker to be as important as he is for a sport. Unless there are other underlying reasons why the creator would want to make sure that the protagonist would be a hero every single time. You see where I'm going with this, right? In giving so much contrast between Harry's life pre-Hogwarts and Harry's experience during the school year, it makes Hogwarts into this extra warm and inviting place, and makes us basically forget all the dangers present. I mean, everyone, especially Harry, constantly talks about Hogwarts as if it's their home. So as a kid, well, suddenly you have this literally magical place where you can go and be at home, where even the most miserable kid ever managed to be happy. On top of that, well, everything in the Wizarding World is basically customizable to you. How many people take Pottermore quizzes to find out what wand, what Patronus, what pet they'd have? How many people read the books and knew from day one what house they probably want to be sorted into? It was more so this stuff specifically that got talked about on internet forums, and not so much about the characters or the plot. Whenever I talked about Harry Potter with my friends, it was never really about what Harry and Hermione had done or what we thought the next book would be like. It was about what we would get up to at night after curfew if we ever snuck out and fucked around the grounds the way the Marauders did. I don't think there's a more telling example for this being true than the reaction that Hogwarts Legacy got both when it was announced and when it finally came out. Because when it was announced, very few people, if any, complained that we wouldn't be able to control Harry and fight Voldemort. No one gave a shit about that. Everyone was excited about going to classes, about exploring the castle, about getting lost in the Forbidden Forest, or buying candy in Hogsmeade. The biggest complaint about the game I see is that we don't spend as much time inside of the castle as we should, and that Quidditch wasn't included. So again, the important through line of what I'm saying is that everything I've just mentioned about Harry Potter that's good is stuff that kids and teenagers do. It's stuff that they experience during their day-to-day, including buying supplies for school. We had classes like math and biology, while Harry, he had herbology, defense against the dark arts, fucking charms. Losing yourself in a world like that was, it was basically hard not to do so. But now, now that we're adults, that stuff's just not for us. Like, no 30-year-old person is still waiting for their Hogwarts letter. And the stuff that would still be interesting to us is underdeveloped and poorly thought out. So why would anyone like it? So I guess that maybe answers my question. And that's pretty much all I've got for you today. Like and subscribe and all that jazz, and yeah, go away.